Okay, please.
Thank you. So, thank you all for the invitation to come here and present. My colleague Nils presented an overview of why corruption matters. That it's not only the right thing to do, but it's also the smart thing to do to fight it, and that less corruption means more aid effectiveness. I will present on what the EU as a development actor is currently doing to curb corruption, analyze how well it is doing, and provide some recommendations for what more it could do. The main message we want to deliver in this session is that the EU could do more and that it could benefit from doing more, and that developing countries could also benefit if the EU did more. The Commission needs to develop a coherent strategy for corruption control in developing countries and invest the adequate resources in tackling corruption outside its own neighborhood. Now, for the next 10 minutes, I would like to elaborate on 4 points that are made in the report. The first is the need to prioritize this issue and to provide the adequate resources. The second is the inadequacy of the current strategic approach. The third is the key role of implementing partners. And the fourth is the importance of building up a strong national integrity system in partner countries for effective corruption control. So the first issue on prioritization and adequate resourcing is perhaps the most straightforward and fundamental point. We found that the EU as a development actor is not prioritizing anti-corruption work in developing countries and that few resources are dedicated to this goal. In our opinion, the EU needs more in-house expertise to effectively disperse funds, oversee the implementation of programs and control how money is spent. More spot checks, better due diligence, tools like randomized specialized audits, better whistleblowing systems, better corruption diagnostics, more intensive use of fraud checklists to identify red flags would, in our opinion, very likely lead to less corruption in aid programs. There is a stark contrast between the level of importance that the anti-corruption measures are given in Europe and neighboring countries versus in developing countries. The ambition and determination that was and is still seen when it comes to home affairs and the enlargement process does not spill over to development aid. Despite an impressive track record of ambitious anti-corruption reforms in countries working towards European Union membership, the current strategy gives little thought as to how corruption can be minimized in development aid. We conclude that the EU could spend aid more effectively if it prioritized corruption control in developing countries. On the second point, on the inadequacy of the current strategic approach, we want to emphasize that you need to get some background to understand why the current situation is as it is. The European Commission's current strategy is developed for member states and for accession and candidate countries. The EU needs a clear plan for how corruption can be minimized in its development efforts. It's not enough just to safeguard own funds and rely on audits. The current strategy puts emphasis on conditionality, but does not explain in great detail how this should be applied to have an effect on corrupt behavior. Not surprisingly, EU country strategies for some of the most corrupt countries in the world have few references to corruption or anti-corruption. So the EU needs a strategy for supporting anti-corruption efforts in developing countries that does not solely rely on audits, untargeted public financial management reforms, and hopes that conditionality will work. Less aid would be lost within EU programming if audits were complemented with other corruption prevention tools and if the EU worked more actively to strengthen anti-corruption institutions and reforms in partner countries. Special attention should be given to strategies for fragile states, for example in any future action plan on security, fragility and development. Policy coherence between the areas of security and anti-corruption should be a priority going forward. The third point on the key role of implementing partners is to stress that the EU needs to ensure that appropriate anti-corruption safeguards are adopted by its implementing partners. As we write in the report, the weakest link in the aid delivery chain is not in the EU's own processes and procedures for controlling own fiduciary risk, but in its handling of situations where aid funds are implemented via third parties. While the EU can rely on partners like the Council of Europe and the OECD to implement anti-corruption interventions in countries within Europe and countries seeking EU accession, the EU cannot use these trusted partners outside Europe. In most developing countries, EU programs are usually implemented through NGOs, contractors, or other multilateral donors, without a clear plan from the side of the EU for due diligence, monitoring, and evaluation. The final point we want to stress is the importance of building up what we call a strong national integrity system to effectively curb corruption. The EU should work more actively to support the development of strong national integrity systems in the countries that receive EU development aid, regardless of whether that aid is delivered by the EU itself through implementing partners or as budget support. Yet we find that the EU currently provides little financial support or strategic guidance for staff on how to support the integrity system of partner countries. The EU should, together with other donors, support the establishment of strong local systems for corruption control. This includes central and local government systems on audit, procurement, and open budgets, but also social accountability mechanisms to enable watchdogs and citizens to check the state. Little of this is actually done today compared to the overall volume of aid that is dispersed. In summary, we find it a fair assessment to say that the EU as a development actor is lagging behind other donors when it comes to tackling corruption in aid. More spot checks, random specialized audits, whistleblowing systems, fraud checklists, and concerted efforts to support those champions of integrity that do want support in developing countries would likely lead to less corruption. In conclusion, our recommendations to the European Parliament are as follows. We hope you will initiate a strategy development process, clarifying the EU's approach to corruption risk management specifically for developing countries, recognizing the importance of both improving own project and financial management systems, as well as measures to strengthen capabilities of partners and implementing agents, as well as national oversight bodies and watchdogs. We also hope you will examine further whether current anti-corruption efforts are cost-effective and whether EU institutions are staffed adequately to reduce corruption risks, and how a whole-of-government approach can be created for the area of anti-corruption that currently seems fragmented. We should also initiate a process to develop guidelines for how to address corruption risks in situations of delegated implementation, to ensure that implementing partners have the required capacity and anti-corruption mechanisms to minimize fraud and waste as much as possible. Budget support should be accompanied with clear plans for how corruption risks would be mitigated and how the effectiveness of these anti-corruption initiatives would be monitored and evaluated. And it would be useful to provide better operational guidance on the use of conditionality when responding to corruption cases and to ensure political commitments. Finally, we want to stress that we hope you will continue the good progress preventing illicit financial flows at the multilateral level and launch new initiatives to build the capacity of developing country administrations to prevent national and international tax avoidance, evasion, and tax fraud, and allow better international collaboration to prevent transfer pricing, manipulation, and aggressive tax planning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for the report and the presentations.